The tale of domestic violence has long since been told. How about I tell it to you through the eyes of religion? Men are in charge of women by right of what Allah has given one over the other and what they spend from their wealth. So righteous women are devoutly obedient, guarding in the husband's absence what Allah would have them guard. But those wives from whom you fear arrogance, first advise them, then if they persist, forsake them in bed, and finally strike them. This is Quran 4:34, and it has come to typify the Islamic view on domestic violence. But how did the scripture come to be? Way back in the 7th century, Habiba, a Medinian wife to one of the leaders of the Ansar, was struck by her husband. Her brother or father then took her to Muhammad, who ruled in her favour. But, a turn in the story, upon receiving a revelation from Allah, Muhammad was forced to revoke his ruling. The clearest connotation behind this religious text is that husbands have a disciplinary power over their wives. Connotations of the origins behind this text are that historically, Islam does seem to have contributed to the painting of a very vivid background for a world where domestic abuse is not outside Allah's will for women. This view is propagated by Hanafi jurist Al-Jassas, who believed that a husband can discipline his wife up until the point of death. But guess what? Quran 4:34 is actually still used today. In a German court, Judge Datz Winter denied a woman a divorce from her physically abusive husband on this basis. And in the UAE, although a husband was fined the equivalent of £85 for hitting his wife and daughter hard enough to leave a mark, the judge countered this by saying that the husband abused his right to engage in physical discipline by exceeding the boundaries of acceptable discipline. This suggests that he had a right in the first place. However, this patriarchal view is not peculiar to Islam alone. Let's take a look at the Christian context.
He used biblical context of obedience frequently. And the most frequent one, of course, is you promise to obey. His view was that he was the male, the husband, and the head of the household. And therefore I should obey him. And by not obeying him, I was being disobedient to God.
End of chapter summary. What have we learnt so far? Religion plays a huge part in the gendered pattern that there is to domestic violence. It also plays a huge part in the theory of intersectionality, the idea that different characteristics shape an individual's experiences. Bograd says, intersectionalities colour the meaning and nature of domestic violence, how it is experienced and responded to by others. As well as gender, race, and class, religion is one of the characteristics that may make one woman's abusive experience different to another's. So, religion, bad guy, right? Not necessarily. To get a more thorough sense of it, the Quran must be viewed as a whole, and on the whole, oppression of women is not encouraged. Take the view on forced marriage. Quran 4:19 says, "Ye are forbidden to inherit women against their will." Chapter 2, to give us a contrasting view of religion's relationship with domestic violence, let's take a look at the Puritans of the 17th century America. The Puritans of Massachusetts Bay were unique in their time in that they were committed to regulating family violence. But were they really these knights in shining armor? Their reason for this commitment was not out of care for the abused women, but instead they were motivated by the thought of building a new world, a city set on a hill, they called it, which is a religious community that is peaceful, stable, and godly. A sin like family violence would jeopardize this stability and godliness. Again, let's have a look at the law at the time. In 1641, the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed a law making spousal abuse illegal. But although the Massachusetts Body of Liberties stated that striking one's wife was illegal, the Puritans believed in preserving the family unit above protecting the physical safety of victims. And so Puritan courts were reluctant to separate wives from husbands. Having just considered a historical Christian point of view, let's now consider a more modern Christian point of view.
In South Australia, Tabitha experienced the same controlling behaviour at the hands of her Anglican husband.
Certainly everything that I did was subject to his approval, including, what I watched on television, what I read, what I ate, what I drank, who I saw, how long I saw them for. Could I use the phone? Could I ring my parents? What did you tell them?
Disturbingly, Tabitha's abusive husband was a priest.
I spoke to 2 bishops, neither of which, again, believed me. It was the first one sent me off for psychological counselling, but they didn't send him off. They just didn't want to believe that it was happening or wouldn't acknowledge that it was happening. All they've done is just sent him off to another parish where he's happily practising still.
End of chapter summary. Note how the Puritans used religion as a way to gain power and control. Abusers do this too. Power is a theme all too common in the religious context. In fact, Al-Khatib created a Muslim wheel of domestic violence as a spin-off of the Juluth power and control wheel to show how religion is manipulated for the purposes of gaining power. This wheel shows how religion amplifies things like Sarkis's coercive control. This section of the wheel modifies the original power and control wheel as it talks about threats that are specific to Islam. For example, the right to wife beating supposedly conferred by Quran 434. In the Christian context, Horn and Bayer also talk about perpetrators using religion as a power tool through biblical literalism. So, does religion do no good at all? Ever considered that religion can actually help victims of domestic abuse? An interview was conducted of 17 Muslim women and found that these women use spiritual methods like prayer and meditation to address the domestic violence they were experiencing. Billingsley also highlights the role of African American churches as a traditional source of support for various psychosocial problems. These churches filled in the gap the society left blank because of the history of institutional racism and cultural insensitivity. Nathan Clark furthers this by highlighting the lack of evidence that religion increases the incidence of domestic violence. Rather than explicitly propagating it, however, religion can be said to do so implicitly through the emphasis it places on the sanctity of marriage. So, the religious connotations in the historical background for domestic abuse have arisen as a result of a misuse of religion, not religion itself. Some ways that religion can help solve domestic violence. It is important to note that criminal justice cannot solve domestic violence alone. Although criminal justice has become the go-to for resolving social and political problems, as suggested by Snyder, it is not always the best way. Rather, a multi-agency approach might yield a more sustainable change. Law can only be effective when it considers culture and religion as well.
The biggest thing is your support system. And a big part for me was church. I got a lot of support through the women's Bible study that I was a part of, through the church. And that, for me, was just monumental.
The role of the church is to actively disapprove of domestic violence by including this in the clergy training. An organization that does this already is Faith Trust Institute. They provide faith communities with the tools and knowledge to address the faith and cultural issues related to abuse. End of chapter 2.